Thank you, Paula. Yeah, so this is a strange experience. So I was hosting the speaker, and now I'm giving the talk, and it's being recorded. And somebody asked me when I came in if I thought I would get the job or not. So, so I'm having I'm going to have to be on better behavior. All right, so yeah, first I would like to say everybody should come to the rest of the human environment coastal systems talks, one of which would have been today but is not. So please come to the next. We have one in 2 weeks. I won't recite the whole calendar, but keep coming. If you are here for that and don't want to be here for this, you are welcome to leave. I won't take it personally. It'll remind me of class. All right, so we're going to talk today about this paper that came out recently. This is, like I say, this is short. The seminar is unfolding in short order. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper, Martin Scherer, who was a research staff here in my group over the last couple of years and is now back home in Zurich, and Jeff Trapp, who's a longtime collaborator of mine from Purdue. So I want to talk about that work. But this is one piece of ongoing research in this area that's fits within the context of the broader research group here at Stanford. And so here is the snapshot from the web page. Danielle, get on the web page. So Danielle is not yet on the web page, but here's the current group, and many of whom are in the room, maybe all of them. And so it's a really exciting group for me to be a part of, and I want to acknowledge all the work that's going on, and start out just by giving a bit of an overview of where we're headed, when this kind of sometimes eclectic mix of papers come out of the group. I want to give you, since it's a chance to get to know the department a bit in this context. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of where we're headed overall, and then how this one paper fits. So the overall motivation for the research group is we're trying to understand the physical processes that create the climate phenomena that most directly and acutely impact natural and human systems. And so this work is really at the interface of, depending on how you define the world, at the interface between climate dynamics and climate impacts, the interface between Working Group 1 of the IPCC and Working Group 2 with some Working Group 3 influences. But really we're trying to essentially use vulnerability of natural and human systems to climate stresses, use that vulnerability, what we know about that vulnerability in the current climate, to understand how the physical climate responds to changes in radiative forcing, and what the consequences could be of those changes in physical processes for different natural and human systems. And this motivation is within the context of the broader huge body of scientific work that shows that climate is changing on planet Earth, that many of those observed climate changes are now well outside the range of variability historically, and also a very large body of work suggesting that if the forcing of the climate system continues to change, particularly through human activities that emit greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and other atmospheric constituents, that if that forcing continues, that we're likely to see very substantial changes in climate over much of the world, both in terms of the global mean temperature, but also in terms of the local climate phenomena that different natural and human systems experience. And it's those local phenomena where that sensitivity to the climate system really is felt that we're most interested in. So I want to show a couple figures from a review paper that Chris Field and I wrote that was published this summer, just to give you some of the context for some of the kinds of questions that we're looking at in the group. So on the left is the annual temperature, and this is expressed as a difference from the baseline period, and this is the mean in this case across a large suite of global climate models, and we're using what was a customized color scale. So I don't know how well the colors come out, but essentially hot pink is above 6 degrees of annual warming. And we can see, well, maybe you can't see, but there's hot pink north of about here in this annual mean plot for the late 21st century of this RCP 8.5 pathway. And I'll talk a little bit about the different pathways. But really over land, most land areas in this late 21st century period are exhibiting greater than 4 degrees Celsius of annual warming. And if we look at lower levels of forcing in the nearer term, most areas of land are experiencing 2 to 4 degrees of annual warming. And a lot of what we're interested in is what does that annual warming, which is really a annual temperature, has very little influence on any of us in the real world. So what we really want to understand is how the kinds of climate phenomena that we feel on a day-to-day basis, how those respond to that level of climate change. And so it really is the extremes where many natural and human systems really feel the climate system. And these are just a couple of examples for context. We know, it's when we look at climate model experiments, there's very strong agreement that a number of different kinds of extremes are likely to increase in severity and or intensity as global warming continues in the future. The most robust response is for extreme heat, and that's shown in the upper left, the map of the projected occurrence of the number of the percentage of years within that 20-year period that exceed what was the hottest year of the late 20th century period. And so even out over the next in the mid-century, in this forcing scenario, much of the world is exhibiting 3/4 or more of seasons that exceed the hottest of the late 20th century. And in fact, when we've looked at the observational record, we find that many areas, particularly in the tropics, are already exhibiting this emergence of larger fraction of area experiencing this severe heat. And we've also looked at snow cover, for instance, which shows a similarly robust response to global warming, with particularly here in our part of the world, in Western North America, by the late 21st century, more than 3/4 of years exhibiting spring snowpack that's less than the late 20th century maximum. So there's a risk of different regions on Earth moving into a climate space that is that's truly novel, in that the distribution is almost entirely removed from recent experience. And in fact, we can quantify the likelihood of the time at which that emergence could occur. So this, again, is just looking at an ensemble of climate model experiments, and in this case, we're looking at the median time of emergence when the coolest season is never again cooler than what was the hottest season of the past. And you can see that in the tropics, there's the median dates are very soon. So they're over the next couple decades. There's a 50% likelihood of many areas of the tropics moving into a climate space where the coolest summer or winter in the tropics, they tend to be similar, is that the coolest is never again cooler than what was the hottest. All right, I'm self-filtering right now. I'll say nothing more. It's hard not to, though. Okay. So I just want to say, this was pretty big news when it was published in 2011. It was way bigger news when it was published in Nature last week. All right. So this is there's we're already seeing increased risk of the kinds of climate phenomena that give us stress in the current climate, and we're already seeing increased risk of the likelihood of those kinds of events, and potentially entirely novel conditions for our experience, but they may not be novel in Earth history, and in fact we know not from work that I could ever do myself, but the kind of work that a lot of people here at Stanford do looking at Earth history, we know that in fact Earth has undergone large-scale reorganizations of the climate system that are very substantial. And so, part of what Chris and I did in this review was to try to put the projected climate changes that we've been talking about into the context of the geologic past and the Cenozoic past, and this is just taking published data and plotting it on a similar on the same vertical scale, and in this case it's the atmospheric CO2 concentrations reconstructed from geologic proxies. So these are from Royer on the left, which itself is a synthesis of other sources. Then the blue is the ice core record of carbon dioxide. The third panel from the left here are these RCP pathways, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about these in a second, but this is the range of future green CO2 concentrations that the IPCC and the international community are using to try to understand uncertainty in future climate change. And then on the far right is a synthesis from Archer et al., which included authors from Stanford, Ken Caldera in particular, asking what would be the level of CO2 if all of the fossil fuels that are known were combusted. So this is essentially a 5,000 petagram pulse of carbon to the atmosphere. And what we see is that we're already, as has been well advertised, the current concentration, which is very close to 400 parts per million, is already well outside the range from the last 800,000 years. It's also likely unprecedented in the last few million years, and it has most likely from the geologic record. And I'm interested to hear anyone's thoughts on the paleosols. But for most of the proxies that have been synthesized for over the last 20 million years or so, these CO2 concentrations are already rare for the last several million years, and under any of these likely pathways for the future, in terms of the future human emissions, we're on a pathway that is likely to put us well outside of the boundaries of carbon dioxide concentrations that to which systems have been exposed over the last several million years. And clearly, if we combust all of the available fossil fuels, then we're in a different a really different regime. And so we wanted to extend this to analysis to just try to look at how the global temperature response that's associated with these scenarios of the future that are shown in the shades of purple and red, how those compare with what's known from the geologic record. And so on the right here, what you're looking at on the horizontal axis is the rate of global scale temperature change expressed as degrees C per century. And these colors are what you've already seen for these future pathways. And these fall along the one-to-one line. We're just looking at the level of warming in 2100. So it's it's per century. And then the vertical axis is the magnitude. So again, the one-to-one line, 5 degrees in 100 years falls on the one-to-one line. And there's some range, some uncertainty. We can talk about that uncertainty in the global temperature response. But when we compare where the climate models say we're headed over the next century in terms of rate and magnitude of global scale change, when we compare with the numbers that are published in the peer review literature for different climate transitions of the last 65 million years, we see that clearly there were periods where the global temperature was even more different than these scenarios for the future. But critically, those transitions occurred over much longer timescales. So 12 degrees in 18 million years, something on that scale. So the point here is, and it would I think a more expert follow-up to this synthesis would benefit the scientific literature. The scientific literature would benefit from more expert synthesis. But just taking the published papers at face value, we appear to be, even for the commitment essentially that we have already in the climate system, the climate change is already baked into the climate system, as some people say. We're looking at least an order of magnitude more rapid global scale change than what we see in the geologic record. And in the upper left, this means potentially very rapid velocity of climate change regionally. And there are a few different ways to calculate this. I see Phil Duffy is here, so Phil's been involved in the Laurie et al., which is another treatment. But here we're just looking at where in 100 years in this scenario do we find the mean annual temperature that's closest to the current mean annual temperature for any given location on Earth. And you see very rapid velocities, particularly at the poleward edges of continents and at high elevation. And this essentially means that the annual temperature of that location is moving out of kind of the regional range. And Southern Africa has to go to Siberia or Greenland to find a similar temperature. So the point here, without going through all these details, is that potentially natural and human systems are facing very rapid reorganization of the climate space in which they exist. And so this really informs a lot of the questions that we're pursuing in the research group. And again, these questions really either generally or specifically are framed around trying to understand the physical climate processes that shape our relationship with the climate system. And we are pursuing these questions in multiple systems, different regions around the world, and different natural and human systems. These are some pictures that I downloaded from the internet. I have, well, I lived in Indiana, so I've seen corn. And I went blueberry picking once. So I've never seen a tornado, which we're going to get to in a second. But actually in Indiana, we do have severe thunderstorms in Indiana. So all the work, there are people in the group who've been out in the field, but I confess that I spent all my time in front of a computer. I did do my graduate education in a earth sciences department where there's a lot of field work, and it was compulsory that just from a cultural point of view, that at their dissertation defense, each student show a picture of themselves in the field doing their dissertation work. And so last night I was able to find my dissertation presentation with my field picture. So that there's evidence that I was in the field. All right, so the good news is that I do have a close collaborator who has spent a lot of time running around chasing storms. Even Bill Paxton, for anyone who's seen Twister. So Bill Paxton actually spent some time in the back of Jeff Trapp's truck when Jeff was in grad school doing the chasing. So I'm very indebted to the collaboration with Jeff, and this is an actual picture that Jeff took, not downloaded from the internet, sent to me via email. So here we are. This brings us to the robust increases. So this is work that Jeff and I and others have been pursuing over the last few years, and I'll focus on the most recent work, but I want to just provide you some context because this is severe thunderstorms, and because they are responsible for a lot of catastrophic loss in the United States, there's a lot of interest in understanding how they're likely to respond, how the physical processes that create severe thunderstorms are likely to respond to global warming. And just as one example, in 2012, there were 11 disasters in the US that reached the $1 billion level for losses, and 7 of those were related to severe weather. So as a whole, when hail, damaging winds, heavy rainfall that leads to flooding, tornadoes, all those damages together end up being a major source of catastrophic loss in the US every year. And part of the challenge is that these are small-scale events in both space and time, and they exhibit very complex physical processes that actually create a storm like this. And there's the processes that create the storm in which this occurs and the processes that create this tornado. And so the severe thunderstorms are really at the nexus of being highly relevant for people who are trying to understand climate risk, trying to understand the costs of each unit of emissions in terms of what kind of damage they're likely to create, because this is a high impact type of event. But at the same time, there's a lot we just don't know about these storms in the current climate, let alone about their physical response to global warming. And one just illustration of that, there were a couple papers that came out earlier this year trying to synthesize the state of knowledge about different kinds of extremes in the US. And these axes are, the horizontal axis is the adequacy of the data. So would we have sufficient data to detect a trend if there was one? And then the vertical axis is the level of understanding of basically the climate, the relationship of global warming to the event. And you can see that for tornadoes, thunderstorm winds, hail, flooding, flooding's a non-unique, but you can see that the phenomena that are related to severe thunderstorms tend to fall towards the left and towards the bottom, the bottom left quadrant of this space. And so this is whether you read the IPCC, the National Climate Assessment, these kinds of synthesis papers, you'll find that severe thunderstorms and tornadoes are a persistent unknown, persistent point of, well, we're not sure about that in terms of the state of scientific knowledge. And there are a few reasons for this. One is that you saw those symbols falling on the left of that axis, and we have real limitations in the observational record. So for temperature, it's not a perfect record. There's not perfect distribution of thermometers around the world. We haven't had satellite observations for all of human history, but we have a really well-developed record of temperature around the globe. It's not the case for tornadoes, right? So there's no independent observation of tornadoes. Basically, somebody says, I see a tornado, and somebody else says, I see one too, and a third person says, well, I saw one, and they all report it, and then somebody at the National Severe Storms Lab goes through and says, well, I think that was one tornado. If a tornado happens and there's nobody around to spot it, that tornado will not get counted. And so we have no independent record of severe thunderstorms generally. We really don't have an independent record of tornadoes. So we're probably at the point where we'll never be able to go back and do the kind of detection attribution work that, say, David does on crop yields, for example. Another source of consternation has been that when people think theoretically about the conditions that cause these kinds of storms, there have been conflicting expectations just when people make theoretical arguments. And essentially, for the conditions that have created severe thunderstorms in the past, one of the major contributors to those conditions is likely to increase in response to global warming in terms of the convective available potential energy. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the other main ingredient, the vertical wind shear, is likely to decrease. And I'll give you a little bit more details about the reasons for that. But part of the challenge has been that just the first order theoretical argument is basically a wash. And so we don't even really know what to expect from first principles. And then when people have looked at climate model experiments at those kind of mean conditions, they get basically the same result as the theoretical expectation. And so that has further created uncertainty. And lastly, as I've already alluded to it a little bit, but basically these are complex physical processes that lead to these events, and we're not able to resolve those processes in the kinds of climate models that are used for running large-scale climate model experiments. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's been done in that modeling area, because that's where a lot of our work in the group is. So there are basically two approaches that have been taken, and neither of them is going to bring you to full satisfaction on this issue, but that creates an opportunity for research. So one is an explicit approach where people have including our group, have tried to develop ways to resolve the processes that create these kinds of events. And the other is an implicit approach, which is to take advantage of the large resource of climate model experiments that have been archived by the international community, and try to use an implicit approach to look at the conditions in the atmosphere in those climate model simulations that don't resolve the actual processes that create a storm, but can potentially give us some sense of the conditions. And just to give you a little bit more sense of the scale here, these are even at the scale larger than the tornado. The tornado is really not resolvable in a climate model. But even these severe storms are still pretty small scale events. So you can see this is this is a kind of a textbook feature, this anvil shape, and this is occurring within a storm environment that is a few tens of kilometers. And so even the storm in which the small scale features are occurring is still more fine than the resolution of a global climate model, of the typical global climate model. And so that's the motivation for this explicit approach. And I won't talk about results today, but that is really where we're going to end up at the end of the talk, is that we need to do more of this. We need to merge, find ways computationally and intellectually to run climate scale experiments at these spatial and temporal scales. So what I will talk about today is the implicit approach. And the reason we in addition to any intellectual limitations, we really don't have the computational resources to run the kinds of climate model experiments that we would want to run to really quantify uncertainty about climate change. And that's because there are many sources of uncertainty, and really even at the coarse resolutions at which the global models are being run now, we still aren't really running large enough ensembles to probe even the large scale uncertainty. And this is just example of one of the uncertainty domains. These are the emissions going from 1980 on the left out through 2050 on the right. And so the black dots are historical emissions globally. And then each of these lines, and I certainly wouldn't expect you to grasp each of these lines, just be confident that there are a very large number of lines on the screen. And what that represents is the many different scenarios that have been generated by the community for trying to project what the climate forcing is likely to be over the next several decades. And what I'd like you to draw your attention to is the red line, which is this RCP 8.5 scenario, which I've already mentioned, and that's the scenario that I'll focus on for the results that I'll show in a minute. And some other pathway is certainly still possible, certainly still available to the world, but it is notable that the real emissions are tracking just above this highest scenario for these. If you look at the four bold colors, which are the four scenarios that are being used in the current IPCC. And so our approach is basically to take the climate model simulations that have been run along that red line, that emissions trajectory, and look at use this implicit approach to look at the atmospheric conditions in those global climate model experiments. And so just to give you some sense of this implicit approach is basically other researchers have looked at the statistics of severe storms that have occurred in the past and identified key ingredients for in which those storms occurred. And essentially, the eastern U.S. is the area of the U.S., but also globally, where there's a high likelihood, relatively high likelihood of severe storm conditions occurring, particularly the Great Plains and Midwest. And essentially, these storms result from the co-occurrence of heat and moisture in the atmosphere and strong vertical wind shear. So the strength of the winds aloft compared with the surface. And that's what's illustrated here. And so basically, we're going to be looking at the CAPE, or the convective available potential energy, and the shear. And I just took a picture out of Jeff's textbook this morning. So essentially, the red dashed line is the moist adiabat. So this is essentially if air just rises and expands, what pathway will it follow in this thermodynamic space? And then the dark black is the actual sounding of the atmosphere, and the CAPE, or the convective available potential energy, is the difference between that actual sounding and this ideal kind of thermodynamic sounding. And so the total area in this thermodynamic space is a measure of the energy available for convection. How buoyant is the atmosphere? This other one is SIN, and I will probably skip the SIN part. All right, so there's a bunch of dots. So essentially what we're using is this Brooks et al. Threshold, and we're just going to ask really simply, if we multiply CAPE times shear, is it above 10,000 or not? And we can talk about more of the details of where that comes from. But essentially what the theoretical expectation is that CAPE should increase with global warming as there's more heat and moisture in the atmosphere. Shear should decrease, and this is due to the thermal wind relation. As the horizontal temperature gradient decreases, which is expected with the pattern of global warming, then this vertical wind shear should decrease. And just to give you a sense of why that is, this is the spring eastward wind. And so this is essentially the mid-latitude jet you see here, and this is a result, the large-scale feature of the atmosphere that's a result of that large-scale temperature gradient. So the expectation is as the pole warms more than the equator, that this should decrease in strength. And with the Cape, the expectation being that warming and increased moisture in the atmosphere should increase the gradient vertically in the atmosphere of heat and moisture and increase the Cape. So I'll skip to what we've done. Okay, so this is the latest work. So if we just walk along that RCP 8.5 scenario, this is what we see for the eastern US for the 4 seasons. And the mean across the models increases in all 4 seasons. The absolute magnitude of those increases and the relative magnitude of those increases varies. I'm going to focus just for the next few minutes on the spring. And the spring shows the largest and most robust changes in the likelihood of severe thunderstorm conditions. It's about a 40% increase by the end of the 21st century. And what we see is that most of that increase that you're seeing in the mean is robust across the ensemble. And so I want to tell you what the dots are really quick. So we're just looking at the signal to noise ratio across the ensemble. So what's the mean across the members and what's the standard deviation of the change between them? So each member has some measure of the change. If it's greater than 1 standard deviation but less than 2, we mark it with a black dot. If it's greater than 2 standard deviations, we mark it with a white dot. And you can see this area of the Great Plains and Midwest that shows both the largest magnitude increases and the most robust changes across the ensemble. This happens to be the global hotspot of severe thunderstorm occurrence at present. So what's happening with the ingredients that are making this increase? Remember that the theoretical expectation is that shear should decrease and Cape should increase. That's exactly what we see in the climate models. It's notable that the increases in Cape show greater agreement across the models than the decreases in shear. But this result basically doesn't leave us anywhere further than we were prior to doing these analyses. Right? So we already knew that the mean shear should decrease, and it does. We already knew that the mean Cape should increase, and it does. So what we've done is try to understand why the increase in Cape is overcoming the decrease in shear. And the first thought was, well, maybe there's just, Cape is having a larger influence in terms of the variability. But when we look at for example, the partial correlation and try to separate out the influence of Cape on the severe variability or the influence of shear on the severe variability, they're actually almost identical between the historical period in the top and the future period in the bottom. So really, the increase in the number of severe days is not because Cape is having a stronger influence on severe conditions than shear. Well, that their relative influence isn't changing in the future simulations. So it must be something else. So we struck out on that. So what we did was we looked at the joint distribution of Cape and shear for each day in each climate model simulation, and this is where we found the explanation. So all of the argument that you'll read in the literature about how severe thunderstorm environments are likely to respond to global warming is focused on the mean Cape and the mean shear. And mean Cape and mean shear really don't tell you anything about, they might tell you something about the likelihood of a severe storm condition, but they don't tell you what's causing the severe storm condition, because that's really basically what's happening on the afternoon of that day. It's really the atmospheric conditions at the subdaily scale. And what we find is that almost all of the decrease in mean shear is concentrated on very low CAPE days. And what this black line is the threshold from Brooks et al. For getting into these severe conditions. And so you see that the decreases in shear are having no effect on severe days. And it's because you're basically losing shear in days that don't matter as far as severe thunderstorms are concerned. So the CAPE distribution is shifting to the right. We're getting more high CAPE days. And that's what's driving the increase in severe thunderstorm environments, because the decreases in shear in the mean are irrelevant at the daily scale. In this work, we've also looked at the 1 kilometer shear, and so this is the difference between the surface and the winds at 1 kilometer, and this has been identified in the literature as possibly indicative of conditions that create tornadic storms. And what we find here in the bottom panel, we're looking at the PDF. So this all adds up to 1. And what we see is that there's a higher fraction in the future. This is the difference in the PDF. So there's a higher fraction in the future of days with high CAPE and high low-level shear. And this basically is as far as we're going to get down the road that we're taking towards having some quantitative constraints on how global warming is likely to influence the storms that produce tornadoes. This is as good as we're going to get. We won't try to push it further. So I'm sure some people think this is too far. But our statement is something like indicative of, or suggestive of the possibility of an increase in tornadic storms, or something like that. It's 12:50, so I'll skip the sin. If anyone Dan, if you want to ask about sin, you can do it in a second. All right, so I'll just summarize that I think there are at least 4 new results, a couple of which I skipped over. But the main one is that the theoretically expected decreases in mean shear do occur in these climate models. It's just that they don't affect the severe days, because they're concentrated in days with insufficient CAPE to create a severe storm. And so what we see instead is an increase in the occurrence, the likelihood of high CAPE, high shear conditions. We also see an increase in the likelihood of high CAPE, low SIN conditions. These all point towards an increasing likelihood of the atmospheric conditions that tend to produce severe thunderstorms. That doesn't mean that there will be more tornadoes with global warming, but it is evidence that global warming increases the likelihood of severe events. From a risk point of view, and many of you have heard Chris Field talk about climate risks. If we frame climate risks as a combination of the likelihood of the hazard times the exposure of assets, human or otherwise, times the vulnerability of those assets, then this is really the hazard term, and this is suggesting an increased likelihood of the hazard, which implies an increased risk of damage from severe storms. The last thing I'll say is that these increases emerge relatively early in this high forcing scenario. And so if we go back to the big spaghetti. So all of the 10 climate models simulate an increase in regional mean severe thunderstorm environment occurrence over the eastern US after the decade of the 2030s for the rest of the 21st century. And even though I focused on the late 21st century, there really is a robust emergence across the models at these lower levels of forcing. And so this suggests that if we look across the likely temperature global warming range in this time period, it's about 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial. which may remind you of the Copenhagen Accord. So just because we've used the highest scenario doesn't mean that we don't see robust changes at lower levels of forcing. In fact, we do see robust changes within that 2-degree window. And with that, I will thank you for sticking around for this non-coastal ocean talk. Yeah, Leaf.
So is there a causal relation between the increased CAPE and the increased shear? Can you analyze that in simulations?
So we can analyze each day. And this is what I want. Okay, so if we look at the left here, this is based on reanalysis. So it's not reality, but it's the reality that we have to look at. We see that actually the high shear days really in the current climate are focused on low CAPE days. And I think what we would want to do to answer your question would be to repeat what we did in the 2009 paper, which would be to try to track baroclinicity basically and try to look at exotropical cyclones on that cartoon they were mentioned. Because it's hard to tell from just looking at these distributions if this is just wind blowing or if these are, if these are coherent storms that are moving through, which certainly do tend to organize. Those large scale systems do tend to organize these convective storms. But in terms of the just the basic kind of statistics, in terms of counting up the days, there doesn't seem to be any indication of a physical relationship between the change in shear and the change in CAPE. Basically, CAPE is increasing in the mean. That's moving the distribution towards the right and putting more days above this black line. Yeah, Fran?
Are we kind of equally confident in the ability of the models to reproduce both CAPE and submersible wind shear, or is there kind of reason to be more suspect with one of them?
Check out this whole section on CMIP5 validation. I skipped. All right, so we can make lots of numbers that are hard to read. Yeah, so the shear, this is, I'm being a little bit crude in just showing you the mean seasonal wind, but because what we'd really want to know would be what's the shear on the days that have high CAPE or have low CAPE. But basically, the models, this is take Leaf's class and you pretty much can get Leaf's class. I'm not saying Leaf's class isn't hard, but you don't need a climate model to get this. Basically, the climate model is just doing what you do in 146A basically on a problem set, and that's basically what the climate model is doing. So this is a feature it's a robust physical feature, and so it's not surprising that the climate models can reproduce it. The CAPE is a little more of a challenge because for a couple of reasons. One is that none of these models is resolving convective processes. Convection is parameterized in all the models. And there's a real potential for feedback between the way that convection is parameterized and the vertical structure of the atmosphere and the CAPE that is calculated. And if you want a very insightful discussion of that, I would look at Chris Skinner's paper from a couple of months ago, where he groups the models based on convective scheme. The other problem that we have is that this is such a huge data volume, and the modeling groups are not saving the data that we would need to answer your question. They're saving snapshots, and so all we get is a snapshot, 4 snapshots a day. And so, if the model has a bias that causes the convection to fire at noon instead of at 3, let's say, to be crude about it, we're going to see a low value of CAPE when we look at the afternoon. And so I would say we have more to fix on the CAPE side than on the shear side. Hari.
So Since the IPCC's moved on from SRES and out of the RCP stuff, I was noticing still that the observations are outpacing the even RCP 8.5 scenario. Are you doing anything with an even more aggressive emissions pathway?
Aggressively emitting more? Like that aggressive being more?
Are we out emitting our own worst expectations?
Well, so I think it's really important. There's a real gravity even in the scientific community, but definitely outside the scientific community, to see the lines as kind of scoping out some likelihood envelope. And there really isn't. Like this scenario, to stay on this pathway requires negative emissions in the second half of the 21st century globally. And so if you're going to get to 2100 and be on this line, then basically the world economy has to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere for the second half of the 21st century. What likelihood would we assign to that? It's not the pathway we're on in terms of the emissions or in terms of policy. Yeah, I guess I'm used to justifying why we use the high one. But yeah, we could, well, these dots will keep appearing. There's the global financial crisis that got us, created greater agreement with the lower pathways. But we bounce back. All right, thanks a lot.